What are some of the lifestyle habits that you think accelerate cognitive decline?
Oh, now look, that's a double-edged sword right there. I think many lifestyle habits can accelerate cognitive decline, such as our diet, what we're eating. We now know that insulin resistance, sugar, high glucose can cause an inflammatory cascade, which can then trigger a neural inflammatory response, which can then trigger cognitive decline. We know that sleep deprivation, lack of quality sleep, inconsistent timings can accelerate the rate of cognitive decline. We know that exercise is probably the most powerful intervention that we have. So not exercising, not getting proper blood flow to the brain is also detrimental.
You mentioned sleep. That's something that I think most people now are aware of, the importance of it. If you could go as in depth as possible as why sleep is so important to master when it comes to cognitive health, I think the audience would really appreciate that.
Well, let's just understand what we're talking about when we talk about cognitive health. So we have a brain and a nervous system, and over time we build up these connections. We have around 87 billion neurons in the human brain, and all of those connect with one another. You've got around 5,000 connections per neuron. So it's like trillions of connections that are happening. And over time, we lose those connections. We lose the ability for one neuron to connect to another. And when these neurons connect to one another, they produce a chemical reaction. We know that it's called a synapse. And this is responsible for our thoughts, our movements, everything. And that's what forms our cognition, the way we think, processing speed, everything, right? So what happens over time is we lose those connections. And We'll talk first about sleep, but that's what cognitive decline tends to mean. And when we're looking at dementia, we have to understand that dementia is the umbrella term used to describe a set of cognitive decline symptoms. So the reason why we know Alzheimer's disease so well in society is because Alzheimer's disease is a form of dementia, and it's the most prevalent. We've got 55 million people worldwide that have the disease. That number is said to triple by the year 2050. So it's a very prevalent disease. Around 6 million US adults have Alzheimer's disease currently, and there is no cure. So a pre-dementia state or a pre-Alzheimer's state is what we call mild cognitive impairment, where you're getting these cognitive complaints or cognitive impairments that seem to be mild. I don't think they're very mild. And one of them is generally driven through not cleaning out the brain. And this brain cleaning process takes place during sleep. So sleep is fundamentally a tool that we have at our disposal. It's free. We get it mixed up because a lot of things interfere with sleep: stress, alcohol, drugs, cigarettes, timing, a partner. And when we think about sleep, we're generally looking at two stages. We look at REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, and we're looking at deep sleep or slow wave sleep. And they're the two things that I really want to focus on right now, because during deep slow wave sleep, it's around stage 3 sleep, we're getting many things that occur. One is we get the release of a lot of our hormones. So estrogen for women, testosterone is significantly produced during deep sleep. We get the release of growth hormone, which is responsible for tissue repair, muscle regeneration. We're also getting the activation of our lymphatic system. And what happens is overnight, the cerebral spinal fluid washes through the brain and it pushes it out through this perivascular space, and it just gets excreted through our body. When it gets washed out, and we've got these specialized astrocytes that are they've got legs on them, they're kind of pushing out the cerebral spinal fluid as well. What happens is they take the debris and the toxins that build up. And it's my understanding that these toxins, such as amyloid beta and these tau proteins, when they build up, they actually, the amyloid beta, for example, they interfere with the networks between the neurons. So if we don't clean it out during deep sleep, we don't clean out these toxins, it interferes with these networks, and these networks can't communicate with one another. So sleep, and we're now seeing more data on actually the consistency of bedtime and wake up times to being the most important. So maintaining a good sleep hygiene protocol is really, really important for a healthy performing brain.
Mm. So I think with that said, I think people think that they can just catch up on sleep. Like if they just go through a few weeks and have poor sleep, that eventually it'll be okay because they can catch up. I've heard you kind of touch on this and why it's not really the case. Like why, like what are the like long-term negative effects of like deprivation?
Well, first and foremost, because your brain loves consistency, you want to maintain a consistent sleep environment. As I mentioned, we're now seeing the most data of good sleep hygiene coming out with the times that we go to sleep and the times that we wake up. And apparently, it doesn't matter what time you're falling asleep. So if you're falling asleep every night at midnight, make sure that you are staying within 10 standard deviations of that midnight every single night and waking up every single night at the same time. But it does not mean that you can sleep 3 hours one night and 12 hours the next, because even on that one night, what happens is your brain still has the ability to build up these toxins. And sometimes it becomes a bit of an overload. We've got this, when it comes to cognitive decline in Alzheimer's disease, we've got a supply and demand issue. We've got this demand, whereas like we've got a demand every day of going to work, putting up with emails or coworkers or whatever stress that you have. So there's a lot of demand there. In order to meet that demand, you have to have a healthy brain. But if you've got this brain that's full of these toxins, it's an unslept brain, and it's at the mercy of all of this demand, you're not going to be able to meet the demand. So the demand takes over and there's not enough supply. So you have to think of sleep as a regenerative tool that is fueling your brain.
So I think with all that said, people, they think about cognitive decline as like forgetting things, not having a good memory, like losing sight of people's names, etc. What do you think are some of the like hidden signs of cognitive impairment that people might not be aware of?
Look, some of the first and earliest signs are episodic memory and short-term memory. What we're seeing is when we see somebody who's got subjective cognitive impairment, which is actually a dementia state before mild cognitive impairment. And what we're seeing is that people start to lose their short-term memory in terms of they can't think of people's names. They can't think of where they left their keys. Now, I don't want that to be mistaken with somebody who's just stressed. I don't have mild cognitive impairment, but sometimes I do forget people's names, or sometimes I do forget where my keys are. That doesn't mean I have mild cognitive impairment. For anybody listening and they're thinking, well, how do I know if I have it? You can go and do something online called a MOCA test, MOCA. It's the Montreal Cognitive Assessment Test. And it's out of 30, and you generally want to hit a score of 30. If you hit a score of 18 or below, 18 is classified as mild cognitive impairment. So anyone can go and do this. And it's a really great assessment online backed by heavy data. And then you want to then get about the business of slowing the progression, because you don't want to get into a place where, and this lasts around 10 years. So you don't want to get into a place where you end up getting to the Alzheimer's space. So some of the early signs, like I mentioned, are episodic memory, short-term memory.
I think people like, they think about this like, oh, I'm only like 25, I'm 30, I'm 35. Like this could not happen to me. I'm sure I'm just stressed. What's a normal age that you think somebody should be experiencing cognitive decline?
Well, I don't think there's any normal age, because I don't think that cognitive decline is a normal part of the aging process. We now have substantial evidence to show that Alzheimer's disease is now becoming optional. And that's a controversial statement, but it is. And so what we have to understand, though, is that Alzheimer's disease is a brain state where your brain has said, I give up. So it means that over the last 20 or 30 years, it's been fighting for survival. So in your 20s and in your 30s, these are when you are building Alzheimer's disease. You can either stop it or you can contribute to it. And we contribute to it in our 20s and 30s because that's when we feel the most invincible. That's when we think we don't need sleep. That's when we think that we can get away with the drinking. I remember I'm early to mid 30s, and if I have a glass of wine now, it completely affects me compared to, I remember, being maybe, I remember having 3 or 4 drinks in my 20s and 30s and waking up and just slamming out a 20K run the next day. I remember those days so clear. I'm like, oh my God. So everything you're doing now in your 20s and 30s really affect how you decline.
So you mentioned that it's controversial that Alzheimer's is optional. And I think people have had this idea for some time that a lot of these diseases, including Alzheimer's, are mainly genetic. I think I've heard you say that Alzheimer's and cognitive decline, in fact, is mostly lifestyle related. Talk about why that is and why, talk about why that is.
Well, let's determine and differentiate between genetic risk factors and genetic mutations. So we have around 20,000 genes in the human genome. And when we talk about a genetic mutation, it is a disruption on that genetic code. For example, if we now know that there's around 30 genes involved in dementia, and if we have 3 of these genes, we know that it's a foregone conclusion that you will get the disease. And these are mutations. They are presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and the amyloid precursor protein. We also hear of the risk factor genes, such as ApoE4. And people think that, if I have the genetic variants of ApoE4, it comes in 2 alleles because you get one from mom, one from dad. If I have 2 copies or even 1 copy of the gene, I'm going to get Alzheimer's disease. But that is not true, because Alzheimer's disease, if you look at the broad spectrum of all of the people who have the disease, around 98% of these people don't even have the genes responsible for the disease, not the presenilin 1, presenilin 2, or the ApoE4 genes. So we can now say that Alzheimer's is largely driven through lifestyle. It doesn't have to be a genetic makeup. Yes, if you have the ApoE4 gene, you have a higher, you are predisposed to the disease. You have a higher risk, 12 times higher risk of getting the disease. Does not mean that you will get the disease. You've just increased your risk of getting it through your genes. But then we have so much information on these genes now that we can then provide a conclusion to say, well, great, you've got the genes. Doesn't mean you're going to get the disease. So what do we have to do now? And that's when it's time to take your lifestyle really seriously. For example, the ApoE4 gene is really responsible for transferring cholesterol in the brain. The brain needs cholesterol, and it gets transported through the brain and utilized and uptaken by the neurons to be used as energy and fuel. When you have a mutation on that gene, or when you have the ApoE4 gene instead of the protective ApoE gene, which is ApoE2, it doesn't help with the transfer of lipids. So what ends up happening is you end up getting these atherosclerotic plaques that build up just like in cardiovascular disease, but they build up in the vessels of the brain. And that can then lead to cognitive impairment, slowing of, we can have atrophy of the actual brain cells. It can even lead to stroke.
That's wild. So you mentioned this MOCA test. I just plugged it into my computer so I can be sure to take it just to see where I'm at. Hopefully I'm at a 30. And then you talked about cognitive impairment and what leads to that. Like, let's just say somebody takes this test and they're at a score where it's clear they have cognitive impairment based on that and the way that their life is going. What's the best way to either reverse it or slow down the progression?
I want to talk about slowing down the progression instead of reversing it, because I think reversing is a term that comes with a lot of like bullets, right? So we need to reversing something is really, I would say it's got to be a very, very strict, structured lab work protocol. So let's say that we've been diagnosed with MCI. How do we, instead of getting Alzheimer's disease in 10 years, how do we get it in 20 years instead? So that's slowing the progression. The first thing that we have to do is look at inflammation. Inflammation sends a signal out to your system to activate what we call the innate immune system. And if we look at the amyloid beta, which is that toxic protein that builds up in the brains of Alzheimer's disease. Amyloid beta is actually an antimicrobial peptide. So it gets it when you activate your innate immune system, which is the body's first defense mechanism against an insult, right? So basically something happens, you increase inflammation, you get all these cytokines that go out, and it basically says protect the body from a threat. That's when amyloid beta is. So amyloid beta is it's not harmful, right? It's only harmful in a toxic load. So it gets built up to protect your brain. And it says, we've got to protect the brain. But what happens is, once it's there, you have to have a mechanism of clearing it out. And the only way to clear it out really is via the lymphatic system during sleep. So that's the first thing. We need to manage our inflammation. From that, we can then categorize different things, such as I'm now looking and doing some studies on looking at toxic mold exposure, for example. So things such as environmental toxins in the air can build up in the system. They can travel through the nose, go up to the brain. Toxic mold in apartments can also interfere with this process. So that's one aspect that we can be looking at. We can also look at your glucose control, getting a standard, HbA1c, looking at fasting insulin, looking at your HOMA-IR, going to a doctor who's well trained in blood work and interpreting blood work can help you along that path as well. And it becomes then a moment of how can I manage my glucose and glycemic control? You also want to be maintaining a diet that is right for you. So you want to look at your lipid panel. That is a measure of your LDL, your HDL, your triglycerides, your cholesterol, your ApoB. Remember, what's good for the heart is good for the brain. So you don't want to become into this state of your cholesterol is too high, your LDL is too high, because your brain is the most vascular rich organ in the entire body. It has so many blood vessels that you need to take care of. So we need to look at that. We need to modify the diet, eating a keto-rich diet as well. So your brain loves ketones and beta-hydroxybutyrate. So looking at that, then you really want to be exercising every day. Walking, we've seen so much research to show that even 1 mile of walking per day can slow the progression and onset of diseases such as dementia, mild cognitive impairment. Resistance training, which is my field of study. We know that when we do resistance training, that dramatically reduces the risk of Alzheimer's disease. And then, of course, sleeping and the community that you are involved with, making sure that you've got good social connections, good people around you, a place to speak and a place to be inspired.
As far as specifics, like if we were really trying to slow the cognitive decline and slow that progression, how much resistance training per week should somebody be doing? How much quality sleep should somebody actually be getting if they're in that stage where they're actually now in a place where they have to pay attention to how they're handling their brain health?
I always recommend people sticking to 3 hours per week of zone 2 training, which is around 65% of your maximum heart rate. And then looking at around 2 to 3 sessions of resistance training per week, making sure that it's fun, making sure that you like it, because adherence to a protocol is probably the most important thing that's going to move the needle forward.
And then what about sleep?
And then sleep, I think that every human needs to be sleeping at least 7.5 hours per night.
So I've heard you categorize exercise into 3 categories: resistance training, aerobic training, and neurocognitive training. Why is neurocognitive training so important regarding brain health?
Yeah. So what happens is those connections I was mentioning, we lose them over time. And that's generally because over time we stop engaging in things that we did when we were younger. Think about when you were a kid, you were climbing trees, you were outside, you were learning in school, you were, at home, like you were doing so much. So your brain is building its connections. As we get older, we stop doing things like that. So neurocognitive training involves things such as hand-eye coordination, reaction time training, processing speed training. So I like to incorporate that for all of my clients. And this is something that we teach at Neuro Athletics. We have a coaching certificate for coaches where an aspect of this module 2 is cognitive performance. We teach you things such as throwing a ball to the wall. Like, how can that be beneficial? Well, you're doing so many things. You're getting grips, you're gripping, you're getting grip strength. Okay. You're getting hand-eye coordination. You're getting reaction time, information processing speed, novelty. These are all things that build new connections. If you learn something new, it builds new connections. And when you build new connections, you create more pathways, neural pathways, and your brain becomes stronger. And I love including this in my day-to-day routine as well.
So what are some examples of that? I mean, I think maybe the last time we talked about like throwing like a ball against the wall and catching it with your opposite hand or something. Like, what are some things that people could do either at the gym or at home that could be like a baseline level for neurocognitive training?
Yeah, honestly, the best thing that you can do is buy 2 tennis balls and start throwing the ball to the wall, and do that 20 times and alternate, throw left hand, right hand, and then pick one leg up and throw the ball with one hand and just keep alternating. Anything that's going to be demanding physically on your system, on your neural system. Remember, you're also taking into account the biggest system of the entire body, well, of the entire brain, which is your visual system. People really underestimate this. We've heard Andrew Huberman say that your eyes are just 2 pieces of your brain, and that is very true, because your brain is processing so much when it is using its eyes. So it even takes into consideration visual acuity and spatial awareness.
I've also heard from people that there's like a direct correlation between when cognitive decline starts and when people like retire, when they stop their career. Talk about the importance of keeping your brain like active and stimulated with new things and purpose and meaning as it relates to what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I really love pointing out this wonderful study from Harvard. It was an 80-year follow-up study where they tracked people over the span of 80 years to see what were the biggest things that helped with their brain health. And they found that the quality of their social relationships was a really big one. So maintaining social relationships is huge. And also this whole notion of retirement it really has to be spoken about, because when you retire, you stop engaging in social activities, you stop learning, you stop placing demand on your brain, you stop thinking, maybe you stop doing math. I've seen my father take a decline in his cognition. A, he had a stroke in 2019, but B, he's retired. So he's not, he was always working with numbers and finances. Now, when, you put a spreadsheet in front of him or a P&L, and he finds it very difficult because he hasn't maintained it. And your brain uses the analogy, what you don't use, you lose. So use it or lose it. So if you stop using certain parts of your brain, it ends up atrophying, because it's like, well, you don't need me anymore, Louisa, so I'm going to go.
And you see people when they get older, they do like crossword puzzles, they do Sudoku, they do puzzles. Have you found like any activities like that to be proven to be effective with brain health as you age?
As long as it's hard for you and it's demanding, yes, but I find that it's not enough.
And so what would be a good replacement for those things?
The Neuro Athletics training that I mentioned, I put a lot of posts up about this, hand-eye coordination drills, handball drills, etc. So being really cognizant of that, of getting out there, building new connections and putting your brain under stress is really important.
So even for people that are like getting old, there's no like age limit for some of these activities that you're talking about?
Actually, it's probably even better for you to do it as you get older.
What about supplements? I've heard like fish oil is super important for brain health, all sorts of vitamins, etc. Which supplements do you think are essential for the brain, and which are a few that you think are highly overrated?
Yeah, so I've got my special 4. I love omega-3 fatty acids, and that's because your brain is made of both fat and water, and the around 20 to 30% of the total lipids in your brain is made of DHA, and DHA comes from omega-3 fatty acids. So supplementing with omega-3 fatty acids can not only help build a better brain, but it can also help with cell membrane fluidity. It can help downregulate inflammation. It's got a really high safety profile. So omega-3 fatty acids is probably one of my favorite things to have for the brain. Next down the list is having around 10 to 12 grams of creatine. So creatine helps with cell energy metabolism. And in order for it to shuttle through to to the brain and be uptaken by neurons, it has to be at around 10 to 12 grams a day. So for cognitive purposes, having around 10 to 12 grams a day of creatine is going to be super beneficial. Then we keep moving down the system and we think to ourselves, what does the brain love and what does it crave? And it turns out that the brain loves and craves antioxidants. So the brain loves selenium, vitamin E, vitamin A. It loves things such as blueberries, blackberries, goji berries. Any type of antioxidants and polyphenols is going to be fantastic for the brain. And then we have to maintain, adequate B vitamins as well.
Gotcha. Is there any supplements you see being promoted online that you think are highly overrated for the brain?
Look, I think that we need more research when it comes to the medicinal mushroom space. I know that I hear the word, which upsets me a lot, the word neurogenesis, because then people think that you can just grow new brain cells and you're fixed with the amount of brain cells that you have. As you get older, you don't build new brain cells, you build new connections between those brain cells. So lion's mane actually is great. It's now getting more of a good rap. It's showing that it can help with synaptogenesis, so building new connections. Other things that I think that are just, misaligned is that people think that if you eat a diet rich in cholesterol, it'll be great for your brain. And that's not true because dietary cholesterol cannot pass the blood-brain barrier. So we needed to point that out. I don't know about other supplements that people think that are good for the brain. Maybe you can shoot them out at me and I'll tell you if that's right or wrong.
I want to get back into diet because you talked about keto, but then you also mentioned that, you can't just eat a bunch of like cholesterol. And a lot of times when people go keto, they eat a high cholesterol diet. So what do you think are the like dietary pattern for brain health? I mean, I've heard about the Mediterranean diet. I've heard the MIND diet. Like, what are your thoughts on all that?
So the most well-studied diet is the Mediterranean diet, or Mediterranean interventional DASH diet, the MIND diet. So there's plenty of things to point out here. First of all, we have to go back to the relationship of cholesterol, atherosclerosis, and the brain. If we want to maintain a good vascular system, maintain good blood flow to the brain, we have to keep our lipids at a reasonable amount. The best way to do that is by having a whole food plant-based diet, because we know that fiber draws out the plaque and the fats and the lipids, right? So we want to be having a diet that's high in those products, but it doesn't mean that we can't be having meat. It doesn't mean that we can't be having sources of protein such as fish and dairy, as long as you're just keeping the ultra processed foods down. So for example, I do around 75% of my diet is plants. The rest is meat.
So the people that are saying that to go like carnivore or meat-based keto as far as brain health, it's fiction, not facts.
Well, the thing is, your brain does like to utilize so the primary fuel source of the brain and the neurons is glucose. When glucose isn't present, it can use ketones, and it's more efficient at using ketones. So this is why we say that having a ketogenic diet is a great diet for the health of your brain, and ingesting exogenous ketones and BHP is also really great for the brain as well. So you have to keep the whole notion of having this diet versus that diet. You really have to look at your blood panel and making sure that you are not becoming, I would say, you're not getting into the cardiovascular disease risk and increasing that.
What about alcohol? What does that do to the brain?
We've seen studies come out of the UK Biobank, which basically states that moderate drinkers have lower brain volume. Now, brain volume means they have lower gray matter volume and they've got interference with the white matter. So the white matter is the myelinated part of the neuron. And over time, once you even have, at least, so 7 drinks is classified as a moderate drinker for a female, I think 13 to 14 for a male per week. And once you ingest that, what it does is it lowers the gray matter volume and it contributes to white matter lesions, which are these tiny little lesions on the white matters of the actual axon. And that is mainly because ethanol, which is the active ingredient in alcohol, it seems what happens is once you ingest it, it seems to turn into acetaldehyde, and acetaldehyde is what is the damaging effect to the brain and the body. So keeping alcohol really minimal, 1 drink a week, probably won't have an effect on you. Keeping into consideration as well, like I get a lot of questions like, well, is wine better than vodka? Well, to an extent, yes. Okay. But it still is a form of alcohol.
So the whole idea that, well, I think that's been debunked, that red wine isn't as good for the heart as people think, because the amount of red wine you would need to drink for the resveratrol benefits is like a liter or something at once. I did a whole series on the pod on cannabis, like THC, and how it impacts the brain. I would love to hear your thoughts on THC specifically, not CBD, but THC and how it impacts the brain.
Yeah, I always tell people that THC is not helping you sleep, and most people are doing it for sleep benefits and sleep purposes. But we now see that not only does it block sleep, just like alcohol. Remember, you have to understand that along with being a neurotoxin, alcohol also blocks sleep. It blocks deep sleep. It blocks REM sleep. It completely obliterates your heart rate variability, which is a measurement of how well rested and recovered you are. So it interferes with many processes. It affects glucose control. It's the same as THC, but what we see with THC actually is prolonged use can also induce a state of psychosis.
Yeah, that was the main takeaway I got from interviewing scientists and experts who covered that, like who did research on it, was that given the high potency THC that exists in today's cannabis, like the risk for psychosis is way higher, especially amongst like kids. Their brain hasn't fully developed yet. I'm sure you've covered this a lot, but I would love to dive into it more, because there is the double-edged sword, and that's caffeine. Like I think caffeine can have some performance benefits, definitely helps give me energy, but I think there's the double-edged sword. Like at what point does caffeine become unhealthy?
So caffeine, being a central nervous system stimulant, is completely fine to have, right? It becomes remember, your brain is like, when we think about it like a bank and compound interest, right? It compounds. So the good habits compound and they have positive effects. The bad habits compound and have negative effects. So you have to think of this as a compounding effect.
I will often drink caffeine like into the afternoon and the early evening, and then I'll wonder why my sleep's disrupted. And I'll look back, I'm like, oh, like I had a cup of coffee at like 6 p.m.
Well, the thing is, so it does have a half-life, so it does block sleep, because what happens is when you wake up, you don't have any adenosine in your system, and adenosine builds up throughout the day. It's this molecule that makes us tired, right? So just imagine, right? You've got all of this adenosine sitting behind a wall, right? And caffeine is actually an adenosine blocker. So imagine caffeine to be that wall. And what happens is you've got all this adenosine building up, and it's just stuck at this wall because caffeine is blocking it. And that's what keeps you awake, because it's blocking adenosine from adenosine making you feel sleepy. And what happens is at that half-life, when that's over, when the caffeine is gone through your system, the wall breaks and you get a flush of adenosine coming through your body. That's that caffeine crash. So then you feel that caffeine crash, you feel extremely tired because all that adenosine's built up. So you have to think about it like that. So caffeine is different, the way that we metabolize it for different people. Some people can have it at 6 p.m. at night and fall asleep fine because they metabolize it, just like alcohol. Some people can have just 1 cup at 11 a.m. That is me. I actually rarely drink coffee anymore. Maybe if I do, it's at 10 a.m. If I do, I don't usually drink it anymore. But if I do, and it keeps me up for hours.
Is there a difference? Is there a difference between the type of caffeine? Meaning, like if you drink coffee or something like an energy drink, is there a difference between the caffeine?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, it's not my area of expertise. I don't think so. I would think that caffeine is caffeine. But I think what is interesting to note is what else is involved or included in that energy drink that is giving you the immediate release of what you think is energy.
What are some of the like other ingredients people should pay attention to in energy drinks?
The numbers, what is involved, like what is actually in there, the coloring. I think I don't trust a lot of these energy drinks. I do have, if I was to have anything, it would be C4.
Got it. I know we touched on this earlier. We talked about dementia. I would love for you to explain as best as you can, like the progression, like the cycle from like somebody who experiences cognitive impairment And then when it becomes dementia, what does that look like? And then how does it go from dementia to Alzheimer's?
Well, so it doesn't go from dementia to Alzheimer's. So what happens is dementia represents all of the different neurodegenerative diseases, such as frontotemporal dementia. You've got dementia with Lewy bodies. You've got Parkinson's dementia. And then the Alzheimer's dementia on autopsy looks like lesions in the brain. And that is due to the amount of A, tau proteins that are built up, and B, amyloid beta. Amyloid beta, that toxic protein that is built up in the brain, happens outside of the neurons. Tau actually happens within the neurons, within the neurofibrillary space where the neurofibrillary tangles build up and they end up breaking that area of the neuron. So what happens is this mild cognitive impairment takes place when you are building up the amount of these two toxic proteins. And then it comes to a point where you then forget where you are, you start to forget who you are. And we actually have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease based on PET scans, based on a spinal tap where you can get some of the cerebral spinal fluid and measure the amount of toxic proteins within the fluid. We have FDA approved products such as lecanemab, donanemab that are a hospital grade intervention where you will go in and pay a very high rate, such as around $75,000 to $80,000 a year, to administer this drug. The problem is this drug has many side effects. One, it's only improving the symptoms. Remember that amyloid beta is just a result of taking care of the symptoms, right? So these drugs are just there to remove, at small amounts, the amyloid in the brain. But once we remove it, we have to figure out what's building up. Why was amyloid building up in the first place? So root cause really needs to be spoken about here as well. So we have to understand what's the root cause of why you're building up amyloid in the first place. And then we have to figure out, okay, great. Well, you also have to understand that once you get Alzheimer's disease, it's very costly. It's very emotional. It takes a caregiver to actually look after you. And they've done studies now on donanemab where they've removed the amyloid beta in the brain, around 4.5 grams to be exact. But the results from that, you end up having increased risk of brain bleeds. And we see the gray matter of the brain actually atrophying. So it's not as if like, oh, well, if I get Alzheimer's disease, I can just go and get the IV medication. It's probably going to do very small amounts for you.
When people get dementia, it's essentially, as far as like lifestyle intervention, is it too late at that point to change your lifestyle?
Correct. Yeah. So unfortunately, by then you lose a lot of your cognitive functions. You lose your will to survive and eventually your will to live. And most people with Alzheimer's disease end up dying of asphyxiation. They forget to breathe. They forget to drink. They forget to swallow. They choke. Sometimes they will just walk and run into something, or they'll fall. And it's really, or even getting an infection and not realizing it. So it's a really sad process that happens, and it cannot be reversed. So this is why I'm spending my entire life's mission with helping people through public education, through my podcast, through my Instagram, really slow the progression and maybe halt the disease.
And so essentially the best way to slow the progression and halt the disease, in your opinion, is these lifestyle interventions that we've talked about and catching it early on, managing sleep, optimizing nutrition, resistance training, neurocognitive training, healthy relationships, blood work.
And then you get these other things such as accessory items, I call them. That is doing things such as, so I'm currently in Los Angeles and I went to my friend's, he owns a clinic. He's a physician and he has hyperbaric oxygen therapy there. So I went into that and we now have seen that these modalities that have been used in a hospital setting are now being brought to the public. So engaging in things such as saunas, ice baths, hyperbaric oxygen chambers can help you stave off some of these diseases.
I know that people, when they think of the standard American diet, they look at it as like the root cause of obesity, right? And why eating a certain way causes obesity, and then can lead to like cardiovascular health, which you've said impacts the brain. You've touched obviously on bits and pieces of the diet, excessive sugar, excessive like processed carbohydrates, and why it's so detrimental to the brain. But if you could just go a little bit more in depth as to why are processed foods so damaging for the brain?
Other than it's increasing the amount of, bad fat that accumulates, your LDL, I hate saying the word bad fats, but that's what we have to look at. And your ApoB, the apolipoprotein B, it's also inducing a massive cytokine storm. So remember how I mentioned earlier inflammation, which can be detected on a blood test by looking at your C-reactive protein, or hsCRP. You want that really, really low, but like really understanding that when you eat these ultra processed foods, not only are they not nutrient dense, like you're getting like no nutritional value from them, you're also increasing your saturated fat intake, which then leads to a higher ApoB, a higher LDL. So you're just not even getting bang for your buck. I don't even know what you're eating when you're in there. It kind of baffles me still when I see somebody with a cigarette. I'm like, oh my God, that's so confusing to me. And it's like, especially here in America, like sometimes I will walk outside and if I see somebody with a cigarette, it's so weird. I'm like, oh my gosh, how are you still smoking? And it's the same for these ultra processed foods. When I see somebody having McDonald's, for example, I'm like, oh my God, like I haven't had McDonald's since I was about 5.
One of the other things you touched on that I think is really important to hone in on is relationships, because I think that often goes, I mean, I don't want to say unnoticed, but if you think about like one of the fastest ways to make somebody miserable and kind of go kind of crazy is to isolate them. Talk about the importance of relationships and like the types of relationships people should be seeking out in order to optimize their brain health.
Yeah. So relationships are based on quality, not quantity, when we're looking at the studies, fMRI studies on the brain. I think, this is my opinion, I think it comes down to the chemicals that are released during bonding and the oxytocin that's released. And oxytocin is that chemical that is responsible for bonding. It's actually one of the chemicals that's naturally secreted when a mother gives birth to increase the bonding with their child. And oxytocin doesn't have to mean through a romantic partner or a spouse. It can mean who you spend your time with. So that's the first one. The second thing that I think is really prevalent with your social relationships is you want a sense of connection. Your brain loves that. It wants a sense of I am safe. So it wants that. But then there's also a factor that I think is important, and it's you become who you spend the most time with, and you become who you listen to. And this is where I think social media is really interesting, because who you follow is who you become. If we're spending 3-4 hours a day on social media, that's equivalent to spending time with another person. It's reshaping and remodeling your brain. So we have to take that really seriously. Who are you following on social media? Why? And what impact are they having on your brain and your health outcomes?
And I'm sure it's also this fine line, because you've talked about people need to stimulate their brain in order to keep it healthy and make it challenging. And sometimes when people are browsing social media, they're like, I'm going to unfollow people I don't agree with, or I'm going to unfollow people that might challenge my thoughts because it stresses me out or whatever it is. How have you personally, I guess, developed a frame of mind for how you follow people on social media?
Yeah, it's hard for me. I'm in the space. I try not to spend as much time on it, but unfortunately, because that's my work, right? That's what I do. I'm trying to show people how to have a better performing brain on public platforms. So I have to spend a lot of time on there. I look at things, if it doesn't make me happy or it triggers a negative response, that's when I'm like, okay, I'm out.
And what about like for following things that like with people you don't necessarily agree with? You think it's healthy to like follow
But that's
people that
great. I mean, if I don't agree with it, it means I'm learning from it. If it's something bad, like cocaine is good for you, then that's a different standpoint. But like, I'd really try and stick to my lane, and my lane isn't nutrition. My lane is Alzheimer's disease, and it is exercise and the physiology of these two. So if I'm learning something that is not in my space, it's interesting. If I don't agree with it, I have the tools to investigate why I don't believe in it or what I think is true through clinical epidemiology, really understanding how to read a study, what to study. So I challenge myself. However, I do try and stick to my lane, and I do know that following my purpose and sticking on that is the most important.
Speaking of, what do you think are some of the biggest like misconceptions out there that you see about brain health?
Well, other than the cholesterol myth, which is dietary cholesterol can pass the blood-brain barrier, I'm not sure because I just am not exposed to it. I think that there's a massive amount of nonsense on Instagram when it comes to Alzheimer's disease, when it comes to cognitive impairment. Look, I've done 15 years of schooling, Doug, to be able to just speak on the internet. And I think when people read something, an article per se on Healthline, they think that they have the audacity and privilege to just speak about it without really understanding the backbone to it. There's so much that goes into this detrimental disease. And that's what upsets me when I see people talking about a disease that they don't know anything about.
Yeah, because I've seen that there like people talk about the ability to like reverse things like dementia and cognitive decline, and you're saying that that's definitely not true, right?
I'm about to interview Dr. Dale Bredesen, and I love him. He's a fantastic guy in this space who does have a protocol where he's seen patients with reversal. But let me tell you, it's not something that is just easily done. It takes a lot of time, money, advocacy, very individualized. So I would say that's probably like 5 out of 1 million people that could do that.
My grandmother died, I think I told you, of Alzheimer's, and it was one of the most painful things I've ever watched because you see somebody die twice, right? They die from you're not knowing who they are, then they die again when they actually die, right? So it's incredibly like painful to watch. I'm curious, you mentioned the things that you've experienced, like with seeing your dad. Like, what does your current like routine look like to optimize your brain health and make sure that you're doing everything you can to prevent cognitive decline?
Well, every day I exercise. That's a first and foremost, whether it's aerobic training, whether it's resistance training. I'm trying really hard now to manage my stress levels. And I'm also catering for my brain in a nutrient standpoint. So I'm doing everything I can to make sure that my brain is getting adequate fiber, polyphenols, the antioxidants that I mentioned. I'm having a diet rich in omega-3 fatty acids. I do maintain my supplementation. I look at my bloods every 4 months. So I'm maintaining a good zinc to copper ratio, B vitamins, etc. Then I'm also trying to sleep consistently, regular at every time, go to sleep at the same time every night, wake up at the same time every morning. And then I'm doing everything, for social connection as well. So it's nothing drastic. I don't own a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. I wish I did. I don't. The newest thing that I'm doing is including breath work. So I'm doing breath work in my daily practice, which is also helping me a lot.
You talked about stress management, and obviously that has a massive impact on the brain. I can tell that when I'm stressed, like my life is definitely not as peaceful as when I'm not stressed. Like I notice my memory goes, my sleep's off, my anxiety's up, all the things. How does stress impact the brain?
Stress impacts the brain in many ways. And honestly, I hate to mention it again, it goes back to raising the inflammatory profile, which is what we need to keep at bay. And then you also have to think about stress and what you do unconsciously. When we're stressed, it kind of lowers our ability to say no to certain sugary foods. When we're stressed, it may interrupt with sleep. When we're stressed, we may have alcohol.
And then as far as like cognitive ability, does chronic stress lead to increasing your risk of cognitive decline?
Yeah. So when we're looking at chronic stress, we're obviously looking at this chronic inflammatory load. And that is what is contributing to neural inflammation, which is like having an inflamed brain. And that's then influencing how our brain cells communicate with each other. Now, some of the things that I use to de-stress along with breath work and taking some time to myself, I do stimulant-free hours, whereas I will walk without my device in my hand or my earphones and just be with myself and nature. I'm also doing things such as getting into the ice bath, getting into the cold water, being out and getting sunlight and down regulating the inflammation and doing what makes me happy. And that's different for everyone. Some people, other things make them happy, like watching TV.
And people often get confused though with chronic stress and eustress, which is like positive stress, like good stress. Talk about why like having like good stress in your life is actually good for the brain.
Yeah, we've got this fancy term in physiology called allostatic load, and that's just the amount of stress load that you put on yourself. And we need good stress because when you place stress upon a system, it grows. It's like this adaptability mechanism. When we stress our muscles, those muscle fibers grow back and they grow back stronger. And we need that. So that's putting stress on a system. When we put stress on our brain in a good way through neurocognitive training, the connections get better. We get slower atrophy. When we have bad stress, quote unquote, which is even a micronutrient deficiency, puts stress on your system, high blood pressure. This is then when we have detrimental effects. In fact, having consistent high blood pressure, like hypertension, can deteriorate the small vessels of the brain. So you want to keep your chronic stress at bay.
And chronic stress also leads to, impacts your sleep, impacts your workout routine, impacts your relationships. So it's incredibly important to take care of all that. Anything else we haven't covered do you think people need to be aware of when it comes to habits to help reduce cognitive decline, slow down progression, and reduce your risk of Alzheimer's?
No, just understanding that you are your own person, understanding your risk factors, go through the family tree, figure out who has had Alzheimer's disease. And I do advocate for an ApoE4 gene test. So then you can then start modifying your behaviors. And so, and a lot of people are scared of this test. It's a genetic test that sees your, test for your predisposition. If it comes back positive, you can alter your lifestyle from there. And then get about the business of exercising, de-stressing, check for toxin exposure in your house, get a HEPA air filter that filters the air in the apartment or your house that you live in, drink natural, good, clean water, stay away from microplastics, and really stay away from anything that's going to burden the inflammatory response.
So inflammation is essentially the main thing that's driving all this, right?
As you can tell, yeah.
Louisa, this has been awesome. You're a wealth of knowledge in this space. I really appreciate all you're doing to help other people, help yourself, and to make a difference in the world.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks so much for having me. I say the same for you. You've got a wonderful platform, and I love that we're friends and we can do this.
Likewise. And I think this episode's going to help a lot of people. So thanks again for coming back on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.